those wonder tales are there also in other places, right? In the Greek traditions, you have these stories, but they've also been forgotten or they've also been tamed. And if you think of the stories of Saint Anthony, right? So the very first hagiography ever written. In the story of Saint Anthony, he goes into the desert and meets a centaur and a satyr, and talks with the
Yeah.
satyr in the desert. And it's like, does no everybody who has an icon of Saint Anthony, do they even know about these wild aspects of the early saint stories? I think everything has been tamed, even in Orthodoxy to some extent. A lot of things have been tamed to kind of fit our modern frame of thinking.
There's a wonderful story about a young lad called St. Kieran, and St. Patrick gives him, he's a young monk, he gives him a bell, and he says, this bell will ring wherever it is that God wants you to create your little church, your chapel.
Mm.
And so Kieran wanders off into Ireland and he has high hopes that it'll be somewhere very beautiful. So he would hang out, I would imagine, in what we would now call Dublin, or he'd hang out in what we now call Galway, or somewhere beautiful like Connemara. But he ends up in a deep, gloomy forest. And sure enough, to his horror, the bell starts to ring and he muffles it. You know, like when your phone goes off and you don't want any, you're in church and you're trying to
Yeah.
turn it off. And I wonder, what is it like for us when a spiritual bell starts to ring and we muffle the sound? You know,
Yeah.
we do this. We don't want to, we want to be like Jonah. You know, we head off in the opposite direction of where God is usually telling us to go. So Kieran, in the end, honors the bell and he starts to build his small chapel. And bit by bit, his first students, his first monastics turn up. And of course, they turn up as a boar, tusked boar, and they turn up as a wolf, they turn up as a fox. And suddenly, Kieran is realizing that the story of Jesus seems to speak across species. Even the
Mm.
animals are interested. And so he sits down round the fire in the forest at night, and for a considerable chunk of time, the first the first willing students of the Christian religion are the animal presences. And then finally, bit by bit, people start to turn up. And you get that in Celtic Christianity, in the early church. Many of the places where even abbeys were created, initially there is an encounter with an animal there. There's
Mm.
some profound encounter with an animal. And that would be the place. This woman I mentioned on the Irish island, St. Gobnet, she finds the place that God intends to her for her by following 9 white deer. So you can
Mm.
imagine the metaphors are so rich, the images are so wonderful for people, because as far as I'm concerned, everybody I meet is a saint in training.
Hmm.
You know, why not? Why not? You know, that's certainly as Christians what we're trying to be. So these are stories that give us, with a little bit of mischief and a little bit of beauty, you know, a road to follow.
Yeah. Yeah. And how, I mean, I've been obviously been talking about this, but I'd like to hear, how do you, because for a lot of people, these stories, they're actually embarrassing, right? They're embarrassing to them because, okay, so he gets a bell, and, or, like animals come to the campfire.
Yeah, yeah.
The modern mind becomes cynical very quickly. And so what do you think their way back into these stories are? How can we, as modern people that drive cars and have cell phones, how can we dive back into these stories?
Well, they're not for everybody. I think that's the first thing. If you really have no instinctual interest in them, then you'll find some other way to live, some other temple to serve in. I feel very strongly about Christianity in general, actually. We should just let the stories be the stories for a bit. We should
Hmm.
stop whacking them over the head with allegory or theory or even too much theology.
Mm.
I'm of the old tradition that Holy Spirit goes where he will. And actually, these stories are luminous. They're stained glass apparitions loaded like the layers of an onion with information and disclosure. So I never try too hard to persuade anybody of anything. I let the stories do the work. And I think as soon as you've got animals in story, animals that talk, and you've got bells that ring, we know we have entered the marvelous. And we know that we have entered a terrain that, for me, is telling me a deeper truth about my life than statistics ever can. You know, I was listening to I've just been praying in a church this morning, and beforehand, I was listening to the radio. And as you know well, the world is filled with invasion and war at the moment. It's all we hear about. And I know from mythology that if you gaze too long at a monster, it will reduce you to ashes. And the correct mythological approach is to have a shield, and you gaze at the trouble through its reflection on the shield. And these stories do that in a fashion. I have lots of friends of mine that have been involved in, you know, activism work of one kind or another, and are simply burnt out by it because there's no artistry to their approach to it. They just fall into despair. So I find these stories really nourishing, really protecting in a strange way. They protect me, but it's what the Mexicans call the river beneath the river. And if somebody is constantly using a certain analytical part of their mind, that is all well and good, but it's not something that Ian McGilchrist would be interested in. It's not that great, or what James Hillman called the poetic basis of mind. Most of us want to hear stories. Do you know, my whole life, no one has ever said to me, if there's one thing I just can't stand, it's a great story. It's never happened. And so I encourage everybody to be storytellers. Don't explore a story without actually telling it, living in the room, living in your jaw, because something essential gets passed on there. So to go back to your original question, I think initially most people are very happy to settle by a fire or even by a computer screen and get told a story. But there can be a slow, protracted, nervous breakdown of your usual way of thinking, quite honestly. I'm famous for this.
That's
you
right.
Know, you know. So I can't apologize. I can't apologize for that. Yeah.
I like what you're saying. In some ways, to some extent, explaining it is not the right way, because there is a mystery which is real, which is that these stories, like I say, from the fairy tales, these legends, all these types of stories, they contain elements which to the everyday life and to the mundane life seem completely absurd. But nonetheless, that type of storytelling is universal. It's universal in every culture of all time. There are stories that have these elements in them. And not only that, but you know, you tell a fairy tale to a child, and the child immediately loves it and is more attentive to it than he would be to a mundane story, even though if you break down the elements in the story, like in terms of everyday causality, it's ridiculous. Like, it's, why is there a talking wolf? Why, what? Like, what, you've never encountered these things. So there is, you know, even just, how can I say this? Like, even just, if we look at our experience of the stories from being a child to being today, there is something necessarily precious about them by the very fact that these stories exist, that they've been told over and over, and that, like I said, even though, you know, when you, Jordan Peterson has this famous thing, it's like you watch Pinocchio, and you see Pinocchio being swallowed by a whale, turning into a donkey, speaking to a cat, and you never ask, you're never bothered by it. You never think, well, that's silly. That doesn't make sense. But why? Because obviously you'd have never so there are deep analogies in us that resonate in these stories, even though we don't understand them.
Yes, and I think it comes to that very strange notion that we find all over the world, that humans have a soul. And a soul is not fed. It seems that the soul is not fed entirely by logic. And usually in our life, the times we feel most profoundly alive are in times of great distress or great wonder, but in some way the soul seems to wake up. And traditionally, in many cultures that are ritually savvy, that don't have an understanding of, initiation, mythologies, the slow process of growing into a human being, we are fed by images. We're not fed really by ideas. Ideas are interesting and we can puzzle on them. But when we want to be absolutely poleaxed by wonder, it is a story, one way or another, that is going to do it. You and I would have been in church on Sunday in the midst of the story of the Divine Liturgy, that very slow ancient dance that we're all part of. And the truth is, don't tell anybody, sometimes I don't want to go to church. Sometimes I wake up and I think, oh no, here we go again. My feet are already aching. But something will happen usually in the second hour of the liturgy,
Yeah.
where I will fall backwards into the arms of the story of the liturgy somehow. I never know when it's going to happen. Never know. Can't guarantee it. But something happens and I get lifted out of my mundane, worried, neurotic mind. And for a period of time, I experience something like grace.
Yeah.
And then I can't sustain it. And so I come back and I'm the same irritable rat bag that I was before I went into church. But I find that stories give me, and forgive me if I've said this before, you end up, I'm sure you experienced this, saying things, and you're like, oh man, have I said this already in the last 5 minutes? You experience in stories pinpricks of eternity. And actually, as a mythologist and a storyteller, I lived on pinpricks of the eternal for 25 years in the stories I was telling. And then, and I do have to say this, entering Christianity, it's not pinpricks anymore. It's a great river that you've entered. You've entered what was hinted at and alluded to in many other stories. Suddenly you've gone from, milk to meat, as Paul would say.